Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a Batten expert chat on water and policy, the path to a sustainable future. My name is Greer Kelly, and I'm joined today by Batten guests John Freedman and Charles Iceland. John Freedman leads global government affairs for Suez Water Technologies and Solutions, which has operations in over 100 countries. Previously, John led global government affairs and partnerships for GE's water and nuclear business units. John is active on multiple boards in the industry, has authored numerous articles, and speaks frequently on water issues. Charles Iceland is Director of Global and National Water Initiatives at the World Resources Institute's Food, Forest, and Water programs. He previously directed the Aqueduct Project, which is the most current, comprehensive, and high-resolution global water risk and mapping tool available. Charles is now implementing the War, Peace, and Security Initiative with several European partner organizations. This new project will develop a near real-time early warning system for water and security hotspots and help developing countries better address these issues. John and Charles co-teach a class together for the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. We're so glad to have them joining us today.
Hey, hello, Greer, and thank you for hosting us. If you can just go to the first page. Okay, great, thanks. So Charlie and I are going to talk about some of the water challenges that we're seeing around the world, and just as important, Charlie, what we can do about them. And I just want to start by sharing this page. This is from a report the World Bank released 10 years ago, where they said the world had, in effect, because of climate change, population growth, and increasing urbanization, reached a tipping point where the demand for fresh water exceeded the supply. And, Greer, if you've been reading the newspapers over the past few years, I think you've actually seen this playing out over front pages all over the world. So 6 years ago, Brazil had its largest city, Sao Paulo, literally run out of water. And then 2 years ago, Cape Town, South Africa announced that it was approaching day zero where it was about to run out of water. Here in the US, California just came out of its worst drought in the past 500 years last year. And today in Chennai, which is India's sixth largest city, they are repeatedly running out of water. When it rains, they're back in business, and then after a few weeks, they run out of water again. So it's a big global challenge. I've just shared some anecdotes with you, and now Charlie is going to take us through in a very data-driven way what World Resources Institute is seeing around the world in terms of water quantity, quality, and variability. And Charlie, after you finish, I'll pick up again and talk about what we can do from a technology and a policy standpoint to ensure that we do have a sustainable path forward. So over to you, Charlie.
Okay, yeah, thanks, John. So if we can advance the slide. Yeah, so I'm going to run, well, we're talking about a sustainable path forward for water, and sustainable implies that there are challenges that you need to manage against. So I'm going to talk about some of these different challenges or water risks. The first map I want to show shows this concept of water stress, and that's for any location on Earth. What is the ratio to water demand to water supply? How much of the supply are you actually withdrawing from rivers or aquifers? And you can see through a lot of the populated parts of the world that are shown here in red and dark red that we've exceeded our limits, and what you see in a lot of these places are aquifers, groundwater tables start to decline. Basically, you're taking more water out of rivers and aquifers than is being replenished, and so in a very someone spending more out of their bank account than is getting paid into the account by their wages. This is an unsustainable situation. So let's go to the next slide. So here you see what I was talking about, groundwater table decline, and a lot of these places where we're taking too much water out of rivers and aquifers, you're seeing the groundwater table fall. Next slide, please. On top of the kind of chronic problem of using more water than you have available, then this situation can be punctuated by drought. And so in a lot of these places, year on year, you're taking too much water out, and then all of a sudden, bam, you're hit with a bad drought, like you are, for example, you were in Chennai last year, that city in India that ran out of water. Basically, they had to wait for daily tanker trucks and railroad cars to come in with fresh water to disperse among the population, about 10 million people, so that they just had the basic amount for drinking water and basic sanitation. So there's drought risk, and next slide. There's also the problem of water that's too polluted to use. In fact, throughout most of the developing world, most of the sewage is just dumped untreated into rivers, and it makes its way into aquifers, and the water becomes filthy. There are disease outbreaks. You can't use it. So that's a huge problem in the developing world. It's also a big problem here in the United States. We hear about cities like Newark and Flint where the water is too polluted to use. Okay, next slide. So there are lots of people in the least developed countries in Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America that don't have water coming into their homes that's drinking water quality, or you know, some places they have that drinking water fountain, you know, near their homes if they live in a small and underdeveloped village. But a lot of people don't have even that, and you know, as a consequence, people have to trek very long ways to get water, or they tap into polluted water sources that give rise to health problems. Next slide. And then, you know, there's the problem of too little water. There's the problem of too dirty water. There's also the problem of too much water. And so we track flood risks, and the flood risks are highest in South and Southeast Asia. But there are lots of places, you know, including the United States, where we're starting to see flood risks increase. So for example, we saw in Michigan very heavy rains together with very antiquated dams. That was a lethal combination, and those dams broke last week, causing huge flooding. And perhaps the biggest problem is the fact that Dow Chemical had its major manufacturing plant just downstream of that flood. And so now there's the real danger that on top of the flooding, you also have hazardous materials in that water. So it's a big problem throughout the world. Next slide. There's also the problem of storm surges that accompany hurricanes or typhoons. A lot of the parts of the world, this is a growing risk, including, you know, southeastern United States and the Gulf Coast. And then, of course, there are huge problems in South and Southeast Asia as well. And then final slide. Next slide. So now this shows you that over the course of the next couple decades, the problems with water stress that we already have are going to get worse. And they're going to get worse for a combination of high demand associated with growing populations and growing economies. And also in certain parts of the world, you're going to have diminishing supply of water. There's going to be less rainfall because of climate change. And so you see this combination in the red areas where a lot of these places are already stressed. They're going to get even more stressed. And so this is just going to be a chronic growing problem that we're going to have to deal with as a global society. So now I'll, I guess, turn it back over to John. I think.
Thanks, Charlie. Greer, if you can go to the next chart. So as Greer, as you said, I work for Suez. Yes, we built the Suez Canal in 1869, but since then have evolved into the world's leading water treatment and waste management company. So we're headquartered in Paris, and we have 20 billion in revenues, 90,000 employees, and 450,000 customers spread out over 120 countries. And from a water treatment standpoint, we operate more than 3,400 drinking water and wastewater treatment plants in 70 countries, serving 100 million people. And we also make virtually every type of water treatment technology imaginable. And if you go to the next page, one of the things that we're really focused on is water reuse. And that's why we've developed this whole suite of water reuse technologies that goes everything from filters and membranes all the way up to something called zero liquid discharge, which can in effect really recover 100% of the water in any wastewater supply. And, you know, Charlie, you were talking about water scarcity. You ended on that global stress map. And I would just say that if you think about how do you address water scarcity, there are really only three main ways you can do it. One is through conservation, simply use less water, and that's a great start, but only gets you so far. Second is through desalination, but that's expensive and very energy intensive. And the third is through water reuse. In other words, taking wastewater and instead of discharging it untreated or partially treated into rivers and oceans, actually treat it to such an extent using this type of technology that you can use it to grow crops, which in the world is about 70% of all water usage, or run power plants. And in the US and other developed countries, that's about 40% of all water usage, or even fill drinking water reservoirs. And today, San Diego, California has a $4 billion program underway where they intend to do just that. And so here's the thing though, we are seeing increasing water scarcity in many parts of the world. We have all the technology we need to take wastewater and treat it so that we can reuse it for all of our needs. And yet the world is only reusing 3 to 4% of its wastewater today. And so why is that? And the answer is it's economics. In other words, it's just cheaper to take water from the ground or a river where it's often free, or even from a potable municipal system where it's almost universally underpriced, than it is to buy and implement these reuse technologies. And so what do we do about that? And Greer, if you go to the next page, what you really need is for governments to step in and create policies that are going to promote more reuse. And that's why I wrote this report, which highlights 150 examples of policies that governments around the world have already put in place to promote more reuse. And they all fall into these four major categories. And the first is education and outreach. In other words, you need to explain to people that it's not only important to reuse water, but completely safe to do so. And the second is remove barriers. In some places like California, you can't take treated wastewater, even if you strip out just the H2O molecule, leave everything else behind, you can't take that water and inject it into the ground without doing other things first. So third is provide incentives like low-cost loans or grants. And the fourth is mandate it. You simply tell people, hey, you have to do this. And by the way, these policies work. Israel has implemented all of them, and they're reusing 85 to 90% of their wastewater today. Singapore, Charlie, is another example I know you know well, which I think they're now reusing more than 40% of their wastewater. And there are many other examples around the world. And Greer, if you can go to the next page. Happily, we're now seeing that take root in the US, where just last year at a meeting hosted by Suez and the Wharton School in San Francisco, the US EPA announced that for the first time ever, the US government was creating a national water reuse strategy. They call it an action plan. And on that same day, which was last February 27th, Los Angeles, California announced that it was going to reuse 100% of its wastewater in the next 15 years. So we're seeing lots of good progress here in the US. And I just want to say that, Greer, if you can go to the next page. I just want to say that it's not just on governments to do more. I think we can all do more corporately and individually. And from a corporate standpoint, this is an example I know well because when I worked for GE, one of the things I did was lead the creation of its global sustainability initiative called Eco-Imagination. And as part of Eco-Imagination, GE set a goal to reduce its global water usage by 25% in 5 years. And after 3 years, it had already reduced its consumption by 45%, and then it just kept going. And so the point is, just by virtue of corporations, standing up and setting sustainability goals, they can make a real difference in the world too. And then there's more that we can do as individuals. And Greer, if you just go to the next page, one of the best examples of that is UVA alumnus Chris Long, who started waterboys.org to provide people in the developing world with safe water. And Suez is about to announce, I guess we're doing it now, an initiative to fund Waterboys and two other organizations to install safe water filtration systems, basically freshwater kiosks in a slum called Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya, where somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 people are living today and don't have access to clean water to wash their hands or drink. And so we're doing this in part in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And with that, Greer, I just want to stop, and we'll be happy to take any questions from you or listeners.
Yes, thank you so much, Charlie and John, for giving us some background and sharing a little bit of your expertise. This is such an important global issue, and I feel better that you all are leaders out in the field. I can see a couple questions are already coming in, but if there are additional questions, please submit them via the Q&A function on the webinar, and I will read them out. So the first one is, what is the most promising example of innovation or entrepreneurialism to solve the water crisis that you've seen?
Charlie, you got to swing at that one.
Well, I think, I don't know if it's the most innovative, but I think one of the most effective examples is the one you talked about, John, that we've seen in Israel and also in Singapore, where they basically, most places they treat their wastewater, and if they're on the ocean like Los Angeles, they dump it out to sea, and places like Israel and Singapore don't do that. Most of, if not all of that wastewater is treated and then reused, sent maybe via special, what we call it purple pipe here in the United States, to irrigate agriculture, right? Rather than join the salt water in the ocean. So that idea of recapturing all the water, the other thing is you have to try to save the water where it's most used, and you mentioned where it's most used is in agriculture to irrigate crops. And one way to save water in irrigating crops is to, traditionally irrigations happen through flooding an entire field. And that's very inefficient because most of that water doesn't go to growing plants, it just evaporates and does nothing. So there are drip irrigation systems, which Israel uses a lot of, and a lot of other more wealthier countries use it as well. They use drip irrigation, and all that water essentially gets used to grow crops. So I don't know if those are the most innovative, but I think those are two of the most effective examples.
Yeah, so I think those are great examples, Charlie, and policy. So in Singapore, it's a policy innovation, right? Make every drop count. And they start with a curriculum for school-age children, kind of viewing that ethic. And I think from a technology standpoint, to me, the most monumental development has been being able to economically treat wastewater for reuse. And I think that what we're seeing now, which is an effort to go to direct potable reuse, which is even more efficient. So what San Diego is going to try to do is take its wastewater, and instead of discharging it back into the environment somewhere and waiting for it to flow into its groundwater aquifers, whatever, it's going to put it directly into its, just distribute it directly to households. And so I think that's a really efficient way to do reuse as well.
Those are great examples. Thank you. The next question is, what steps can we as individual consumers take to alleviate the problem?
Well, somebody once suggested to me, and it really resonated with me, that the number one thing you can do for the environment in general, not just for water, but it includes water, is change your diet. So each type of food that we consume uses a certain amount of water per calorie. And beef is very high in water content, so per calorie. So if you can reduce your beef intake to maybe from several portions a week to maybe one or two, add more vegetarian options to your diet. That's something you can do that not only conserves water, it conserves land, it conserves energy, and it pollutes less.
So that's a good kind of macro perspective, but on kind of a micro level, I will say this, that, water is not equally distributed on Earth. And Charlie, one of your maps showed, hey, some areas have too much water, they have flooding, and some have too little water. And so if you're in an area that has too much water, you really don't have to worry that much about taking a long shower. Now, there are other issues where the energy you're using to heat the water, might contribute to climate change because of carbon emissions, that kind of thing. But Greer, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. It kind of depends where you are in the world. But I do want to say that there are organizations out there like the World Bank that are really making a big difference globally, particularly in the poorest places on Earth, to try to make sure people do have access to safe water.
Thank you so much. So I see a question coming in from Dean Solomon, and his question is, he's interested in your perspective on water crises between riparian states. So for example, between India and Pakistan, or potentially China and India, Canada and the US. What do you consider to be the most promising means of water cooperation rather than conflict? And are there particular hotspots that worry you most?
Well, I'm smiling because I happen to know that's an area Charlie specializes in and has written some papers on. So Charlie, I'm going to let you handle that.
Yeah, well, there was a great example of India and Pakistan negotiating the Indus Water Treaty. So that is basically the lifeline of Pakistan, and it's also the lifeline of a lot of northwestern India. And in 1960, the World Bank brokered that negotiation where they decided basically, I think the western 4 tributaries of the Indus would be Pakistan's purview, and the eastern 4 tributaries would be India's purview. And, they negotiated it, notwithstanding all the animosities over other issues that, of course, everybody knows they've had throughout their history. So water was basically a force for peace between these countries that on other issues just were kind of head to head. Now I think that treaty's under pressure, and it's under pressure because you have more people needing more water and more energy. And India's been building dams in areas that have traditionally been Pakistan's purview, and Pakistan's worried that they're going to have less water as a result. And India's assuring them, no, it's a run of the river dam. None of the water gets siphoned off. But Pakistan's asked for international arbitration. So even that treaty, which is held up as kind of poster child for good cooperation, is under pressure these days. And then, of course, India worries about China because China sits even further upstream from it in other major rivers like the Ganges, the Brahma, not the Ganges, but the Brahmaputra, I think, could be tributaries of the Ganges. And then Bangladesh sits even further downstream on those rivers. And so China's just, made some indications that it's going to develop dams and perhaps siphon off some of that water, which would then translate into less water flowing into India and Bangladesh. And so, I guess the moral of the story is, first, if you're going to be in a confrontation, be the uppermost riparian. But more importantly and more productively, negotiate treaties with the other countries. Everybody needs water. It does you no good over the long term if you're depriving the people downstream of their water.
And Charlie, I'll just add that the U.S. State Department actually has a team that does try to defuse disputes over water around the world in the interest of maintaining security.
It does, yeah. Mhm. For example, on the Nile Basin, that's a highly disputed basin where, well, Ethiopia is almost completed. I think they're now starting to fill what's going to be the largest dam in Africa, the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. And of course, about, I don't know, 85% of all the water that flows into Egypt originates in Ethiopia. And so it's not an exaggeration to say Egypt is deathly afraid of that type of action upstream of it by Ethiopia. And they are trying to negotiate together with Sudan, who exists between Ethiopia and Egypt, a tripartite agreement on how that dam will operate and how much water will flow and all the other things that downstream riparians need assurances of in order to be able to plan and to figure out if they're going to have enough water.
Thank you so much. So there's a high volume of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to combine a couple of these so that we can touch on some different subjects. So I'm seeing a lot of questions in regards to Israel. One in particular is curious about the financial value Israel put on water to increase its focus. What price does it need to be valued at globally to move things forward?
Okay, I'll take that one. Charlie, feel free to add to what I said.
No, I was hoping you were going to take that one because.
Number one, Israel has a very sophisticated water tariff system. So they charge different prices for different types of water, and they put a price on reused water that encourages people to use it. Number two, as an overarching rule, Greer, you really need to charge a price for water that reflects the full cost of capturing it, storing it, treating it, and distributing it, and allowing for extra money to invest in needed future infrastructure, because infrastructure wears out over time. And until you get to a full cost pricing tariff, which will vary depending on where you are in the world, you're not going to have a sustainable community water system. There will be chronic underinvestment, and that's pretty much what we're seeing in many parts of the world. I'll just add a third point, which is, while you need full cost pricing, you need to do it in a way that creates a social safety net for those who can't afford to pay that tariff, because water is a fundamental human right. I mean, I think you can live 3 days without it, something like that. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to keep moving along for as much time as we have. So is the movement towards plant-based foods a promising and meaningful reduction of irrigation water, or is it a proverbial drop in the bucket?
No, I think that's where the big money is. That's where the big impact is. So in a lot of developing countries, poor countries, between 80 and 90% of the water that gets consumed is for agriculture. So if you can shift diets in those countries or in developed countries as well, from these very water intensive food sources to less water intensive food sources, you're moving the needle on the biggest usage of water. See, the proverbial drop in the bucket is actually the things that people worry about, the long showers. I mean, I once had a colleague yell at me at WRI because I kept the water on while I was washing my hands or something. You're the water guy, well, what are you doing? And I explained, first of all, we're not in a water scarce place. Second of all, this is the drop in the bucket. This is nothing. If you want to do something, don't change your diet, for God's sake. So I don't know what her diet was, but she was very mean to me. But yeah, that is the proverbial drop in the bucket. Is these things for household water that doesn't use a lot of your water, generally speaking, as a society.
I'm going to keep going until they tell me to stop. So the next question is, Is dissolved oxygen an issue that you're looking at?
I don't know. It's, wait, in what sense? That's from Bill Geisler, I guess.
It
He's
is.
a nuclear guy. Bill, that's too hard a question. I think you just have to move on, Greer.
Okay. I'll ask some broader questions. So in your chart earlier, you mentioned that there was going to be increased water stress in the US in the next 20 years. Can you elaborate a little bit on why that is?
Well, there are parts of the Southwest where models show that there might be as much as 30% reduction in rainfall in the coming decades because of climate change. So that will reduce the available supply of water. So that's a place where, unless the demand comes down commensurately, which it could, but it's hard to make that happen. But if it doesn't, that could lead to increased stress. On the demand side, you know, we're not in a period of economic growth right now, but generally economies grow. Generally, population of the United States is probably not growing a lot, but the economic growth by itself is an engine for driving up water use, unless you can, again, decouple that water use from economic growth and find ways to produce more things with the same or less water as you used to use. So that's what's driving future water stress in the United States.
That's very interesting. And what effect does COVID-19 have on at-risk areas in regards to water access?
Well, COVID-19 is a big deal for access to safe water. You know, something as basic as being able to wash your hands, you know, and that's, Greer, going back to that point I made earlier about a Suez donation to a consortium of philanthropies, including waterboys.org. I mean, that's to create, you know, these freshwater kiosks in a slum so people can wash their hands and get access to safe drinking water as well. And it's an acute problem, even in places here in the U.S., like the Navajo Nation, which is, you know, mostly in Arizona and New Mexico, but also part of Utah. And 30 to 40% of the households there don't have running water. And so that's another thing we're looking at from a philanthropic standpoint, is what can we do to help put some clean water stations in schools and healthcare facilities so people can come and wash their hands. And also, I'll just add this, that the World Bank is deploying COVID relief in 100 countries right now, representing about 70% of the world's population, and access to clean water for hand washing as well as drinking is one of their primary areas of focus. So it's a big deal.
I can imagine. So I think this is probably going to be our last question. And it is, if you were advising new policy students who care about the issue of water availability and quality, what would be your top 2 or 3 suggestions about what to read, what to study, and where they should look for internships and jobs?
Well, you should call Charlie if you're interested in an internship or a job. And I'll let you decide if you want to share your contact information, Charlie. But in terms of, you know, I think pursuing your interest in water, I would just say this: if you know, there are a lot of jobs in Washington, D.C. because it's the policy center of our country, and there are a bunch of committees in Congress that focus on water and other environmental issues. Those are great places to work. US EPA has a program called the ORISE Fellowship Program in the department. You can get that specifically in the Office of Water. That's a great place to work. Charlie, I said you because think tanks like the World Resources Institute are such a great place for young people. And I know that our students at Penn besiege you with, you know, applications for internships and full-time jobs. But anyway, those, I think tanks, you know, policy jobs in Washington, D.C., some of the industry trade associations that focus on water are all good places for students to pursue their careers. And in terms of reading materials, I don't think there's any one particularly good book out there, but maybe some WRI materials.
I'd say that the most interesting thing for me about water is how multidisciplinary a subject it is. You have to know a bit of everything to really think through the problems and the solutions. You have to, even a social scientist like myself has to learn a certain core amount of how does hydrogeology work. You have to learn the mathematics of modeling water systems, which can be quite complex. You have to think through the economics of the water industry, as John was talking about. Costs and if you're not recovering your costs, well, you can't supply the product. And then I think the core of a lot of water problems are political, politics, and so the water world needs people who can kind of go out there and solve problems that involve groups of people who are often at loggerheads. So it's a very interesting subject. I think you should tackle it from the beginning where your interest is highest. So, if you're not a big math person, don't start with the models. If you like economics, don't start there. But be prepared to learn some of all those things, because it's a very subject matter cross-cutting type of issue. And I'd say start wherever you want. There's a ton of information out there, and there's never been a time in human history when people could access more information than you can right now. Just Google it.
That's great advice. Thank you for sharing that with our students and with the Batten community. I can't thank you enough for taking time to join us today. This was a fascinating topic and obviously very popular, as I can still see questions coming in. So you've given us a lot to think about and certainly to go out and do. Do you have any final words for the Batten community before I let you get back to the rest of your day?
I just want to thank you, Greer, and thank Batten for hosting us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's great to talk to the students and yeah.
We'll have a thank
be
you all.
Happy to come back. So.
Oh, we hope that we will continue our relationship going forward.
Excellent.
Thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon.